afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Hello and welcome to the CPS and CapEx Gallery. My name is Emma Revell. I'm the Centre for Policy Studies Head of Communications and Public Affairs. And thank you for joining us for our latest panel, Net Zero Business, Is Government Helping or Hurting? Kindly sponsored by Pernod Ricard. I'm joined by my panel today, if I start on my left, by Kevin Hollinrake MP. He's the Member of Parliament for Thirsk and Malton, who served since 2015. As well as being a previous member of the Treasury Select Committee and a co-chair of the APPG on Fair Business Banking, he is here today as the Minister for Enterprise and Small Business. Next along is Jonathan Brenton, is the Director of Public Affairs for Pernod Ricard's 3 UK businesses. As I said, Pernod are kindly sponsoring this panel, and they are a leading global producer of fine wines and spirits, and as I say, we're delighted to have their support today. Next is Kate Nicholls. She's the CEO of UKHospitality and has been since 2018. And last but not least, Jim Bligh is the Director of Corporate Affairs and Packaging at the Food and Drink Federation, leading on the FDF's priority campaigns, including EPR and DRS. So welcome, thank you all very much for joining us. I'll start by asking the panel to make opening comments. I'll then ask a couple of questions and then I'll throw out to the audience. So if you want to put your thinking caps on, we'll come to you in about 20 minutes or so. Can I remind you all to put your phones on silent if you haven't already, and I will ask Kevin to start with his opening remarks.
Thanks, Emma. Delighted to be here. Well, the exam question was, are we helping or hindering, I think. We are definitely helping. And if you look at the UK's performance here, we've cut our emissions more than 80 of the G7 economy. We're at 44% now below where we were in 1990. Some people might worry about Rishi's statement last week in terms of changes to some of the targets, but they did not change any of the overall targets in terms of our decarbonisation. The strategic direction is exactly the same. Some of the tactics have changed. So the strategic direction, 44% already. Our target for 2030 is 68%. Reduction from 1990 levels, 77% reduction by 2035 and 100% reduction by 2050. None of those have changed by a single percentage. What Rishi did, which I think is very sensible, is look at some of the stakes in the ground that we put in the ground on things like oil-fired boilers and electric vehicles. And I represent a rural constituency, and people were very worried about replacing an oil-fired boiler in 2026 and what you put there instead. So I think it's very practical to say that was probably the wrong tactic, and we need to change some of those tactics. And electric vehicles, the same. We know range anxiety still exists. I've driven an electric car for 6.5 years around North Yorkshire. I've had some range anxiety over that period of time. So we need to do this in a strategic fashion, not where just plucking tactics out of thin air. If you doubt any of some of those numbers, and they are all numbers that are proven in fact, of course, read the Climate Change Performance Index about the UK's performance in terms of mitigation of climate impact. We are 10th in the list of countries that are named in the Climate Change Performance Index, which is assembled by an independent organisation called German Watch. And we're ahead of any other G7 nation. There's a couple of the European countries in there, like Norway and Sweden, which have some natural advantages. But basically, if you look at Germany, France, clearly the US, any other country you care to name, other than a couple of those European countries and smaller countries, we are, we're well ahead of any other G7 nation. Talking about the G7, of course, the UK, when you look at this, it contributes around 1% to international emissions. So yes, we want to be a world leader, but it's pointless as being well ahead of the pack, because that's going to have very little impact in terms of emissions overall. Between China, India and the USA, they contribute around 49-50% of international emissions. So we need to do this collaboratively across the Western world. So we want to do this in a way as well, of course, where we don't impact on our economy unnecessarily. We want our economy to thrive as we decarbonise. Lots of particular interventions that I could talk about that we'll probably talk about in more detail when we go through the Q&A, but lots of things in terms of energy efficiency, 6.5 billion in this Parliament, another 6 billion committed over the 3 years following this Parliament, UK Business Climate Hub, Lots of things we're doing in terms of helping businesses to decarbonise at a micro level as well as some of the macro points. Skills, of course, hugely important, and also under my remit as Business Minister, I also look after some of the reporting obligations that we're implementing as well, and things like greenwashing, to make sure there is a fair and level playing field in terms of how companies will report on their credentials in terms of carbon mitigation.
Thanks. Just before I come to you, Jonathan, there are some seats at the front if anyone wants to come forward and take a seat. Jonathan.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, thank you to the Centre for Policy Studies, and thank you very much for the Minister finding time to come here. And I want to first of all explain why we, as a company that produces and markets fine wine and spirits, would want to sponsor a discussion of net zero. And what's really important to us is there's an understanding that net zero applies to all parts of the economy. So thank you, Minister, for saying the micro and the macro and all bits in between. And it's thousands of individual decisions by businesses. And it's natural that debate will focus on some of the big structural economic sectors and issues, energy, transport. And it's not an either or, that's very important to us too. But we are keen to see attention and discussion around what consumer-facing sectors need to do, and including the role of consumers and the need to work with consumers on those changes. And in terms of the exam question, we are very keen to have a partnership with government and for business to do things by itself. There is certainly scope for government to help, and I can touch on those things, but there are things that business can do, including with other businesses. And I'll give one example of that. We have an ambitious target to reach carbon neutral distillation of our whiskies by the end of 2026. You may enjoy whiskey, you may not. You have absolutely right not to if you don't want to, but you can't make whiskey without boiling water, without making heat. So we are pioneering a heat reduction technology which has cut emissions by over 50% in one of our distilleries. What's more, we're sharing the findings of our trials with other companies in the sector. So over 200 other participants, including our competitors and including SMEs, have signed up. So this is one thing that business can do. How is government helping here? Well, I'll give you, it's quite a technical example. I hope some of you, if you're lawyers in the audience, you won't pick me up on it. It's really important if you're a business and you're working with other businesses to advance net zero goals for a sector, you stay within the bounds of competition law. I mean, that is a hugely sensitive issue for all our businesses. It's very helpful. The Competition and Markets Authority has issued guidance which encourage businesses to collaborate within quite defined guardrails. So that's a very important example. We also had seed money from the Scottish Government for this project. It wasn't a necessarily large sum of money, but when you're a business taking decisions which you need to clear with head office, and we are a French investor in the UK, we employ 2,000 people with the headquarters in Paris, it helps that government is helping to take on the risk. Just to round off this example, where could government do more to help? Well, we have an issue which I think is very common across the economy, which is grid connection. And this goes back to the micro and micro point, because a lot of the debate focuses on how you connect an offshore wind farm to the grid. But there's also an issue with how you connect a distillery which employs 10 people to the grid. And we as a business recognise we have to pay. You pay for a grid connection. What we'd like to do is to work with the local network operators to have more transparency in connection. So when they have a whole list of companies wishing to join, they can prioritise that. What's going to have the biggest impact in the local area? Who's ready? And how might you bundle up? If you ever travel to a place like Speyside, where we have many of our distilleries, it's a cluster. It's a cluster of excellence, all exporting, all different companies. To what extent can we join up on that? So there's other issues, but I'll leave it there because I've probably spoken already too long.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here today. It's good to be a part of this debate, which is a really important one. In answer to the exam question, is government helping or hindering? I think key point, building on what Jonathan said, this is not just about government and whether government is helping or hindering. This is a three-way dialogue, and we will only tackle this kind of issue in carbon net zero and climate change if we do work across all three parts. So I just wanted to draw three elements together. It's about government, it's about business, it's also about consumers, and give you an overview from the hospitality sector about what we are doing in those three spaces to try and work together, because it is about co-creating those solutions. And one of the things that we have been doing, really pleased to work with Kevin, he chairs the Hospitality Sector Council, his colleague John Whittingdale chairs the Tourism Sector Council, and Mark Spencer, the Food and Farming Minister, chairs the Food and Drink Sector Council. All three of those have as their core looking at sustainability, looking at carbon net zero, looking at climate change, and in particular co-creating solutions between business and government to help nudge consumers. So that's at the heart of what we're doing across government. I happen to be one of the fortunate or unfortunate ones who sit across all three of those sector councils. So my job in our consumer-facing space is to try and make sure that we've got commonality and consistency across that thinking, because this is such a big challenge. I think one of the things that we all do collectively is try and identify solutions. What we need to do is to get commonality and consistency of approach. I'm a huge fan of Dave Brailsford at Sky. When he'd had the Sky cycling team, he said the way you deliver big changes is a large volume of small incremental change. And that's what we need to be able to be working at. So that's what we're prioritising at the Hospitality, Tourism and Food and Drink Sector Councils, to get that commonality approach. And at UKHospitality, working with our fellow trade associations in the space, we set up and developed, right at the heart of COVID, when we, as a sector, were in a point of maximum crisis, set up our Carbon Net Zero Forum to be able to deliver that. So I agree with Jonathan entirely. There's an awful lot of the solutions that rest within businesses' hands. So we set that up. We have our own targets for reaching Carbon Net Zero across hospitality and the supply chain by 2040, 2030 for the phase one emissions that are in our own scope. We've worked to establish carbon calculators in partnership with Sky Zero, an environmental sustainability guide for SMEs, and some tips and tricks from some of the best in the business, from our major hotels and event companies like this space, who are working on energy efficiency and looking at what are the Betamax versus the VHS in the energy efficiency route, to make sure that small businesses in the sector know what to invest in, know what to put their money in. When money is tight, you need to make sure you're investing it in the right way, right the way through to the very banal but hugely important points, where Revolution to Cuba, which, a small plug, we have got a drinks reception later on, they found that they removed 70% of their emissions by taking out the passion fruit slice in a porn star martini, because that was a big area. So if we can tell them that that's the biggest selling cocktail in the UK, they are the biggest selling cocktail maker, we can reassure an SME that they are not going to get a consumer backlash. That's where business comes together and nudges the consumer in the right direction. I think that's really important. Second point is about nudging that consumer, making sure we are going with the direction of travel. This weekend, you had the ban on single-use plastic finally implemented. That is an example of where government, working with business, can nudge consumers, can be ahead of consumers, but take them with us in a journey to be able to make sure that when it happens, you don't get that backlash. People feel that it is reassuring. In contrast, I think governments across all four of the devolved administrations haven't necessarily worked with business in the same way to take consumers with us on the journey around EPR and DRS. And that is an area then moving on to the third point, I should say, where government can help. Government needs to set the framework, work with industry to look at the best ways of delivering to that objective, but not be overly prescriptive in the way we are going to meet that objective. That's where we get those good outcomes, like the single-use plastic ban, rather than the negative outcomes where you have to do big screeching U-turns because the costs of DRS in Scotland, the way it was going to be implemented, would have just devastated an entire sector. That's the way we get positive change. And I do think government can help by setting that framework And then there's a couple of other areas to help on. One is around grid connectivity. Jonathan's absolutely right. The second is in making sure we've got incentives to ensure that small businesses in particular invest in the green technology when they are refurbishing and making capex expenditure. You can use the rate system, you can use some of the capital allowances systems, but it must be right that we have a bigger incentive when we refurbish, for example, a kitchen space and do induction technology that takes out ventilation and takes out air conditioning, that we have it's more expensive to do. If we had an incentive built into the system, that's where government can help us all move and make those small incremental changes that together will make a big difference. Thank you. Jim.
Thank you very much indeed. It's easy speaking last because I can agree with all the previous speakers, which makes it a lot better for me. I represent the Food and Drink Federation, so around 1,000 businesses all around the country, from the really largest manufacturers to the global companies making the food and drink that you love, to the small manufacturers that are on every single constituency around the UK. And our collective ambition as a sector is to reach net zero emissions by 2040. We're more ambitious than other sectors. At the global end, our big international companies want to do that globally and often want to do it sooner than 2040 as well. We're the largest manufacturing sector in the UK, so we play a really important role in helping the rest of the country get to that net zero point as well. And it's part of a global effort. Businesses of all sizes are making a difference all around the world on water reduction, on carbon use, on how they can reduce the plastic that they use in their packaging, for example, on automation, on logistics. In every single area that we look at as an industry, we are trying to reduce our emissions and trying to get to that ambition of net zero by 2040. And I think that's where the incremental changes point that has been made by other speakers really comes into it. It's the small bits and pieces that we can do, as well as the big ambition and as well as the big changes, will make a big difference. We at the FTF are working with our members to come up with a strategy for how we'll do that and how we can bring that target slightly forward as well. One of the areas, and I think the big one for me to major on here, is packaging. We use a lot of virgin plastic in packaging. Our mission is to eliminate that. At the moment, we need to use virgin plastic because it's the only way that we can have food-safe packaging to keep your food fresh. So if you harvest potatoes now, put them into a crisp packet now, you can still be eating those next year. And they're fresh, and they're safe, and they're healthy, and they're nutritious and delicious. But we need to create a circular economy for that packaging. So you can turn a crisp packet or a yogurt pot back into a crisp packet or a yogurt pot. Now, we as industry are really happy to do that, and that is what we need to be doing, and we know that. We need support from government to partner with us to get to the point where we can. And that's not just piling regulations onto us and piling taxes onto us and saying spend billions of pounds more every year, give it to us as government, and we'll do very little with it. That's about creating a circular economy at all levels. So local authorities improving their recycling facilities. That is consolidating existing infrastructure so we can recycle more and create more materials at the end of it that can turn back into food-safe packaging. At the moment, I think government doesn't think in that way and thinks it's kind of industry's problem and we can give some money over and that will help solve it. But that isn't the answer. The answer is for us all to work together in a strategic way to get to a point where we're creating that circular economy, but also in a way that's visible to citizens. So if you buy a bottle of Pepsi or a bottle of Coke, you can take that back into a store through a deposit return scheme, get some money back for the bottle that you put in there, and we then get the packaging back so we can turn it back into the next bottle of Coke or the next bottle of Pepsi. So making it really visible so we win the confidence of the public in the changes that we're making as well is a really important part of the picture, I think. How can government help us? I think being clear. I think being honest about the challenges and saying, well, we've got to this point, we need to get to this point, and these are the steps we're going to help put in place to get there. And partner with us. A lot of the changes that we all need to make will require investment, and that means that government has to behave like a really reliable partner. So investors, global investors and local investors know that the money they put into the system will give them a decent rate of return. Constantly shifting the goalposts does not help at all. So we're asking government for consistency and clarity and to be that reliable partner so we can work together to make sure that we reach the ends that we'd all like to get to and create the conditions for investment that is a massive opportunity for our sector but also for citizens to completely change the way that we interact with food and with drink through packaging and through every other element of the system so we can get to net zero as a country and as a sector as well.
Thanks very much. If I could start by asking, Kevin, in your opening remarks, you said that there hadn't been no overall changes to the targets on net zero, which is the tactics we were using to get there. But Jim, you pointed out that actually we need consistency in business, especially investing in the long term, does need consistency. But at the same time, there are things like delays to extended producer responsibility and DRS that businesses very much needed because the processes weren't ready or the timescales were just not reasonable. So where is the balance between needing long-term clarity but also some changes, actually industry pushing for delays or different processes?
I think it's a very fair question and a very, very fair challenge. As I said, the strategy has stayed the same in terms of that glide path, but the tactics change. It's as John Maynard Keynes once said, as the facts change, you change your mind. And I think the facts have changed, to be fair. We've had COVID, which we didn't expect. We've had cost of living crisis we didn't expect, war in Ukraine, all these these have piled massive pressure onto businesses. I think without those, probably the dates wouldn't have changed. And let's be fair about this as well. We've seen some political instability, which I apologise for. A number of different parameters, different kind of conference last year, although I wasn't even here. But so I think with a different leader, of course, an institution is the length and shadow of a single person. So with a different leader, you're bound to get a different approach. And I think what you'll see over the next year is the real risk coming through and saying, this is what I really believe, and therefore this is the impact on policy. So it's a combination of the events, it's a combination of listening to business, and we do listen to business all the time. I mean, we don't just say, here's the problem, you get on with it. The DRS is a really good example. The amount of work that's gone into the DRS north of the border as well as the rest of the UK, which is an issue itself in terms of consistency. We want to do a UK-wide scheme, ideally, and that's what businesses want. So we do spend a lot of time working on this stuff and trying to understand the needs of business. So at times, we don't want to put pressure on business at a time when they're already under a massive amount of pressure. So giving business that glide path, and it's now has been put back, DRS and extended producer responsibility to October 2025. I think, unfortunately, that was the right thing to do, but it hasn't changed our ambition in terms of getting there, in terms of making it a more circular economy, as you quite rightly put it, but also in terms of meeting our strategic goals.
I think it was hugely important that government did finally, perhaps belatedly, listen on that point, because those two policies, DRS and EPR, were developed pre-COVID. And 3 years later, when they were picked up again and taken forward, you did really need a COVID pause, and you needed a COVID reset. So I think there are two different elements going on there with some of those regulatory pressures. But also, if you've got a food price inflation environment where, in our sector, food prices, input cost price inflation is running at 20%, and you have pressure to make sure from the businesses that you don't pass that on to costs to consumers and make things worse in a cost of living crisis, anything that is coming down the track with regulation is going to impose business costs, not just directly in terms of taxes, but the amount of management time and headroom that was being diverted to be able to implement that. So I think absolutely right to take a pause, and the industry then is working really hard to make sure that we are delivering as fast as we can, as swiftly as we can, in a way that meets objectives but doesn't harm the business and doesn't harm jobs and employment in a sector that is so big. And collectively we've got 3.5 million people working in hospitality, 1.5 million in the supply chain upstream. That's before you take account of retail. This is third largest employer.
Yeah, I think that's a really important ask of government, that there's a coordination across Whitehall, some of these initiatives.
Absolutely.
I mean, we have a big excise duty hike, and we were facing a 10p increase from outside, coming from other government departments, from DEFRA, for example, on extended producer responsibility. We very much welcome the delay in extended producer responsibility, but the ask would be government look across the activities in all ministries and think what's the cumulative effect on business and on the consumer.
Yep. Can I just respond to that? I absolutely agree with you. My Secretary of State, Kemi Badenoch, has been very clear. The Department of Business and Trade is the front door of business. Any issues you have, please come through our front door. And if you've then got issues with DEFRA or whoever else it is, we're happy to take those away and work collaboratively across those departments.
I think we talked a little bit about areas the government can help. One thing that hasn't really been mentioned yet, I don't think, is skills and the shortage of green skills. So when it comes to training, colleagues or in the wider sector, what can the government do to help support you in where green skills are lacking, and what is it that businesses can take on themselves without needing government support? Jim?
I think part of it is about the apprenticeship levy, and the apprenticeship levy, every single business organisation will talk about tweaking the apprenticeship levy here and there to make it work. But I think what we've seen over the last sort of 5 or 6 years since it was introduced is a significant drop-off in the number of apprenticeship starts. There were 1.3 million apprenticeship starts between 2010 and 2014, I think, and that number has substantially fallen since then. And there are a few complex reasons for it, but the levy really does need to be looked at as a policy to make sure it incentivises people to offer apprenticeships as a really valuable career route that we all in this room know that it is. But part of that, I think, is keeping that up to date and keeping the skills needs up to date. We as businesses know what skills we need for the next few years, and we know what challenges we're planning for, what we're investing in. And if we know, say, that we're setting up in one of our factories, we're setting up an anaerobic digester, and we need 15 people to work on that digester to produce power for the food plant to work, then we know roughly which skills we're looking for. I think we can all be better as businesses, but also local authorities, colleges, universities, and so on, at saying, right, we've got this challenge. How are we going to get the pipeline of skills development to get the numbers through so we can meet that challenge? And I think with apprenticeship levy reform, what would be great from DFE and from DBT is to help us match that demand a little bit more to the supply that's available and keep those skills really fresh. I used to work for an Indian company, and it was a big Indian IT company, and we hired about 15,000 people every year in India. But what we'd do is we'd say to the Indian Institutes of Technology, right, these are the specific programming skills, the specific cybersecurity skills we need, and they would respond immediately. So within 6 months, you'd have a course that would meet the skills needs. I don't know we're there yet. We could be, and the opportunity is there on green skills for us to be a real world leader by really matching supply and demand in a more intelligent way. I think we need to at the moment.
Jonathan, would you agree?
I mean, I just had 2 quick things. One is the importance of STEM subjects, so beginning the pipeline earlier. And I think there's a role for business to attract talent. I mean, one of the things we're trying to do in the whiskey sector is there's a perception that whiskey is a sort of legacy industry. It's all very quaint and picturesque, but there aren't any big, exciting scientific challenges. We have a chief chemist. We have big engineering challenges. So we are reaching out to schools, to universities to attract people into our business. So it's a matter of wanting people to study these subjects because they will see they'll get exciting jobs from it. And there's a job for us there.
I've just got 2 additional points to build on that, because obviously we're not in that big engineering manufacturing space. What we are doing already is to make sure, picking up Jim's point, picking up and making sure that we are embedding green skills across all of our core foundation hospitality apprenticeships in food and in front of house serving. And again, working with the Hospitality Sector Council, we're developing a universal entry passport, a sort of basic skills training that will be a nationally accredited training programme. Green will be built throughout that, and we'll build on sort of, the RAP, Guardians of Grub courses. In our sector, where we would like apprenticeship levy reform, these are a lot of short additional top-up courses that could be usefully done over and above a core apprenticeship. So we can build in the basics, but then doing top-up green skills, it might be that it's just a 3-month or a 6-month course. It would be really great if we could have the apprenticeship levy reformed more broadly to allow a proportion to be used for accredited national training that is a bolt-on to an apprenticeship.
So Kevin, the Labour Party have already committed to transforming the apprenticeship levy into a skills and apprenticeship levy, which delivers, I think, probably on some of the flexibility that's required. The Conservative Party not been quite as open to that. Do you think they could be in future?
Well, I said earlier, we're the front door of business, and we work with other departments to try and get what business needs, and we don't always get our own way, put it that way. But we are keen to keep pressing the point. And it does illustrate how, the downsides of government intervention generally is if the government intervenes in a big way in something, it doesn't necessarily deliver what it should deliver on the ground. It has good intentions, but so to me, having run a business myself for 30 years, the people who are best placed to decide upon the training needs of their staff are businesses, not governments. So would I like to see more flexibility in the apprenticeship levy? Absolutely, we should. I think the other point in all this is making sure that business is better joined up with education.
Yeah.
And businesses are crying out for it. I was with a company, Ernst & Young, yesterday. They just opened a new branch in Northern Ireland. I said, why do you go to 1,000 jobs? Why do you go to Northern Ireland? Well, A, we got a bit of encouragement, financial encouragement to go there. Northern Ireland has those kind of schemes available, which we helped to design. But also, it said the education there is so well joined up with our needs. So we know people coming out of universities and further education meet our needs more effectively than any other part of the UK. And we need to do that better. And that's a combination of things. It's Ofsted, it is T-levels, which we are doing, so people can go a technical route. It is apprenticeships, all those things, but we need to do that much more effectively. And when I go around the shop floors, I go around engineering companies, for example, and talk to young apprentices or older apprentices, I'll say, where do you find out about your apprenticeship? And the numbers of people who said, from my head teacher or from their careers advisor are few and far between. It tends to be from their friend or their uncle or their dad or whatever else it is. So there's a mismatch there going on in terms of our conveyor belt of education and properly offering people choices in which path to go down. And one area that really can help with this, which Manchester is a great example of it, which has now got the responsibility for higher education, is devolution. So no better person in Manchester than Andy Burnham to say, okay, we want our educational establishments to bring implement these kind of training courses, these kind of degree courses. And devolution is something we brought forward, and it's happening right across the country, even in Yorkshire. So really, really good that's going to be a key part of this of the solution.
I was going to throw open to questions, but if I can ask my colleagues with the Q&A mics to get ready, I'm just going to say, since you've praised devolution in that regard, I wonder how the rest of the panel feel about devolution in other regards. You know, if we have the Scottish Government moving with a different DRS scheme, do we include glass? Are we not including glass? That's just sort of one example. How difficult is that for businesses when different nations are setting different targets?
I think business won't go into politics, but I think there is a principle around a seamless UK internal market which really matters.
Yeah, absolutely.
And to give you an example how things could have gone wrong, there was a plan to have glass included in the DRS scheme north of the border and not included south of the border. So if you're living in Berwick-on-Tweed, and this happened, and you've gone on your shopping trips on both sides of the border, you might have been confused what you do with your bottles in terms of sending back to the supermarket. The supermarket would have the confusion of having English or Scottish bottles coming through. And we as a business would have had to put on two different sets of labels. And for those who are in business, you recognise what a pain this can be. If you're not in business, you think a label can be changed overnight, it's often up to 6 months. We export to 160 countries. We have enough labelling business dealing with 160 countries without having 4 or 5 in the UK. So our approach on this is very pragmatic and practical. It's not for us to get into politics, but we do think that one label for the whole of the UK is where we should be going.
I think that is so important. The UK is one single market, and that is one of the bedrocks of our success as an economy over the last few decades, and we've got to preserve that. I mean, it's not for us to opine, I think, really on whether devolution is appropriate or not, but for areas where there is a single market impact, it's absolutely critical that businesses are able to treat the UK as one whole. But, I'll give you an example on the labelling thing. One of my members has 2,000 what they call SKUs, stock keeping units, so 2,000 different products. If they were required to change the labels on each of those products for England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland for, say, DRS, but it could equally be not for EU labelling or any other of the issues that are coming out at the moment, that would cost them around £2,500 per SKU every time they have to change their labels. So you can work out the costs of that. They're pretty chunky. Now what that does is push prices up for you. It also reduces choice for consumers, particularly in the smaller markets than the UK. So it would reduce choice in Wales if Wales has different requirements in DRS, as is currently looking possible and quite risky. It would reduce choice in Northern Ireland if there's a difference between what happens there, what happens in the Republic and what happens in the rest of the UK. So it's really important, I think, that the UK government focuses on how we keep that single market intact. and how we minimise costs for businesses and minimise that impact on you as consumers in the prices that you pay every day in the supermarket.
I mean, Kate, you raised the issue in your introductory remarks,
Yes.
so clearly it's an issue for the sector.
It is an issue for the sector. I mean, it's more of an issue practically for implementation purposes for the people who are further up the supply chain. But when Jim says it increases costs for you, there's a middleman in between the customer as you and the manufacturers, and that's my members. And they're the ones that are grappling with it. They're very small net margin businesses. They are the ones grappling with the cost increases coming through. And it's the law of unintended consequences. Devolution to me only makes sense if you've got a clear national framework. Whether that's tourism taxes, whether that's licensing, whether that's planning, it's the same when it comes to packaging and environmental regulations. You've got to have that, otherwise you have unintended consequences, and some other sector or the consumer becomes collateral damage. It's the good intentions. The road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Indeed. Right. Has anyone got any
Can I
questions?
just make one point?
Yes.
Just on devolution. I mean, the one message I'd give about devolution, I'm a massively supporter of it, but do not use it as a political football.
Yeah.
Because it will be to the detriment of business, which is then to the detriment of consumers.
Quite.
So, as Churchill said, business is the strong horse that pulls the whole cart. If we suddenly put ourselves as politicians, it wouldn't even exist without business, because you pay the taxes that actually pays for our wages and everything else and every public service in the country, but then to make life difficult for business, absolutely irresponsible to do that. That's not what it's about. We've given power away through devolution. This was our project. We knew we were giving it away to people, mayors that would be opposition, elected as members of the opposition. Absolutely fine, but do not then use it to make life difficult, and that's whether it's Manchester or Scotland or wherever else. It's absolutely responsible to do that, because all our prosperity depends on what business does.
Thank you. Right, any questions? Can we take the lady in the orange jumper?
Hi, thank you for that. It's Phoebe Cook from DSMUG. This is just a question going back to the kind of question of the whole panel about net zero. And obviously there have been assurances about the government not shifting the 2050 target. However, Claire Coutinho has called net zero a religion at this conference, and there's been kind of frequent attacks on eco-zealots. So I'm just interested kind of how compatible are these kind of anti-net zero sentiments with the decarbonisation of business? Do you think that business can remain unscathed and can make progress in this area whilst we have these attitudes from the government? Thanks.
Did you want to speak on?
I'm very happy to. I mean, I think in terms of eco-zealotry and a target to get to 2050 are two different things. Zero carbon by 2050. Rishi Sunak has been very clear that position is absolutely sacrosanct, and it's staying where it is, where it's always been when we legislated for it. So that's not going to change. I say that the tactics around it will change. I think it's perfectly reasonable to have some speak out against people who stop other people going about their daily business. And I think that's perhaps what Claire was saying, although I haven't seen her specific comments. But the key thing is, can we meet the targets? In terms of the 2030 target, which is the most pressing target, we've already identified 90% of the things we need to do to get to that target. There's another 10% we need to identify, and some of that will have to replace some of the slightly slowing down of some of the targets, like oil boilers, electric vehicles. But we can achieve those targets without it getting in the way of people's lives, which we do not want to do.
Do any of the businesses feel that anti-net zero sentiment feeds into your thinking, or are you committed and on the path?
We're committed. You know, as a sector, we're globally committed. We're committed locally in the UK and much more locally than that as well. We're concerned about the food system, and we're concerned about climate change overseas and the impact that could have on the food system here in the UK, but also everywhere else as well. We need to make sure that's robust and it's safe and it's secure and it's sustainable. And the way we do that is by taking a lead as a manufacturing industry and making sure that we are pulling out all of the stops to get us to that point that we need to get to, whether governments around the world want to or not. I think what's been impressive about the UK government is that they have been committed to this, and they have had a world-leading position on it in the last few years, and we just encourage them to maintain that. But part of that is about being realistic about what they can deliver and their part of the bargain, and being that reliable partner to us as industry as we take the lead in pushing down that agenda as well.
I mean, what I would add to this is, as a consumer-facing business, we take a consumer-facing attitude to this. Our consumers around the world expect us to move. There is a question about the speed in particular areas, and that's a perfectly natural debate. But our products will not be competitive globally if people do not see them becoming more sustainable. So we have to be committed to this, and there will be different views in different countries, but it's quite clear that the mass of global consumers want to move in a particular direction.
I would just add to that. I mean, I agree with both my colleagues, but as well as being consumer-facing industries, we're also huge employers, and we are disproportionately employers, in particular in hospitality, of a younger workforce. Therefore, the ESG agenda is broader than just looking at environmental issues, looking at sustainability, and you need to take into account workforce. There's consumer expectation, there is public expectation, there is our employees' expectation of us to be able to move forward and do the right thing. And then there are also commercial imperatives. You have an energy crisis that means you look more sensibly at how can you make sure you've got a sustainable, effective, efficient energy supply to your business, because that's such a game changer in our sector for viability and profitability. So there are some very sensible and real reasons why you would do it, as well as the moral imperative that both of my colleagues have touched upon as to why we're moving forward with this. And you're picking up on a couple of the dates. Those were particularly domestic. For our industries and our sectors, we're still moving ahead with our own carbon net zero targets and our own delivery along the government's route map.
Thank you. Right, can we take the lady in the flowery top and the gentleman at the front? We'll take two.
Thanks. I'm Sarah Chisnell from the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Scotland. And I kind of have two questions, if that's allowed. The first one was just, I can't not say something about grid connection, because in my 30 years working around policy of public affairs, I feel like it's just always been there, the issues of that. And obviously in the net zero agenda, it affects so many different things. So really just either, I suppose, from the Minister, an indication of how things are going with that, and maybe from the rest of the panel, how important do you think that is to get that right? And the second was, is the government going to be looking again at how it incentivises businesses as well as consumers to be more energy efficient? Because isn't really the key to all of this is looking at energy use reduction, and no matter how much we talk about different forms of energy, we've still got to use less. And how do you think we could best tackle that?
Yeah, and then the gentleman at the front.
Good afternoon. My name is Richard Katz. I'm Chief Exec of an organisation called Glass Futures, which is dedicated to decarbonising initially the glass container industry, the flat glass industry, glass fibre, and subsequently across the industrial world. We are heavily supported by government in answer to the net zero business. Is government helping or hurting? Yes, it's tremendously helping. We are a membership organisation where the major global players, including Pernod, Ricard, are members, contributing members financially to enable Glass Futures to develop new methods of manufacture of glass bottles,
Sorry, can I just move you on to the question? Thank you.
The question is, how can government continue to support this work which industry can't afford on its own?
Okay. Kevin, did you want to take that one first?
Yes, please. I'll take Sarah's point as well if I can. So the stuff on grid connections, everybody's mentioned it. I think it's an issue for me as a constituency MP, as well as in terms of my role as contributor towards the net zero agenda. A number of different things. Nationally significant infrastructure project status. We're going to have a fast track approach to this in terms of energy connections, which will be good. That's a big stuff. You've got two levels of grid, the national grid and then you've got the regional grid networks. So Northern Power Grid in my area, we're having tremendous problems getting the kind of backhaul, if you like, in terms of the connections to the substations, but then back to national grid. So the Ofgem review of this, in terms of how those projects are prioritised, will be important. In terms of businesses, well, the government can't pay for all this stuff, let's be real about this. but we've got this SME climate hub now for businesses can go on there to identify the savings, identify their carbon footprint, and then identify the savings they can make by going to an EV. I've had an EV for 6.5 years, as I said before, and so you as well, okay. And I have not had it serviced once. So there are some actually lifetime savings you can make through EVs. So a lot of it's about education. In terms of the, Richard, I think great to hear what the government's doing to support you. In terms of the particular sport programmes, I'm very happy to work with the relevant department in terms of maintaining those. I guess a couple of things that are important here. It's not just about making materials, it's about the circular economy. AB InBev now have got a project with other providers, which Kate probably knows more about than me, but where refillable bottles. I speak as a former milkman, well, my dad was anyway, I was delivering milk for him, that we did that every day, and going back to that circular economy where you're actually refilling the same bottle. And the other thing we're doing within this is and I think Jonathan mentioned it before, is asking the CMA to make sure our businesses can collaborate and set aside some of the competition rules that are set there for cartels to really make sure they can work together, because it makes perfect sense to have a refillable kind of bottle strategy or initiative right across the piece, rather than just one company doing one thing, another one doing another.
I suppose going to Sarah's question about how to incentivise business to reduce our energy use, energy prices are probably quite a good incentive, but do the panel want to touch on that a bit more broadly?
I think I touched on it in my opening remarks, really. I mean, you know, it is undoubtedly the case that some of the green technology that improves energy efficiency is more costly to put in. And therefore, if we can look at ways of enhanced capital allowances or using the business rates regime to incentivise people to put in place those changes, that would immeasurably help. Yes, you're absolutely right. The Ofgem reviews for commercial energy contracts and bringing down those energy prices particularly would help, but also the Ofgem piece on connectivity. And that grid connectivity piece is also vital. You know, the tourist infrastructure, if you think about it more broadly, and hospitality, is going to be critical to meeting those targets on electric vehicles. Our whole industry at the moment is premised on coffees and grab and go when you go and fill up your car. We are going to have to put them alongside businesses where you can sit inside and have half an hour while you charge your car. That means that we need to put those charging points where people use them, not necessarily on streets, or not exclusively on streets, and that is going to have impacts on grid connectivity too, you know, for a lot of the rural places, and that's where you get the anxiety with electric vehicles, and I speak having used one as well. You've got that range anxiety that you are suddenly in a remote tourist spot, and can you charge your car? We need to make sure that we incentivise people to put in those charging points, and that means not charging the rural pubs and the rural campsites the costs of upgrading the grid.
I think there's a point about planning as well. I was working with one business actually in Scotland who were looking to put solar panels next to an existing site, and the solar panels would have provided around 60% of the energy to power this quite large food factory, and the council said no, and eventually the council said yes, but it took a few attempts to go through that, and years and years and years of negotiating to get there. I'm not entirely sure I agree that we'll use less energy. We need to be more efficient. Manufacturers are all about improving efficiency, and that's really important. But I actually think we might end up using more, particularly as we use more technology, more computers, more computing power requires a lot more use of the grid. That means that the planning system has got to be better. It means that accessing the grid has got to be easier. It means there should probably be a presumption in favour of using renewable energy that we're all trying to get to. But let's just take some of that friction out of the system in trying to get to that point, I think. And if we are going to use more energy, let's be realistic about where that comes from. If that comes from green sources rather than coal, oil and gas, then that's a good thing. So I think we just need to have that debate in the round about how we get to that point. But there's small steps governments can take around the UK to get us there.
Okay. Can I quickly just say something about glass? And thank you for everything you're doing, because glass is one of those materials we take for granted. We don't think of its carbon cost. To make glass, you have to boil sand at 1800 degrees centigrade. That is always going to be a very heat-intensive process. And for different manufacturers to work together with our big suppliers in glass to see how the power sources could be changed is very sensitive in terms of competition policy. So that's where the Competition Markets Authority stuff really kicks in. And it's something that, as a business, as an industry, we're looking to change. We are lightweighting our bottles. We're looking to transport them less, so you ship more liquid in bulk, so you don't have these heavy bottles. Packing them differently. These are all examples of the small decisions you have to take. And we are trialling alternatives. In Tesco, in Manchester, we trial paper bottles for Absolute. But it's a big technical challenge, because to make a bottle entirely of paper with no plastic is quite hard. And to make sure that bottle has the same qualities of security, reliability as glass is a challenge.
Indeed.
It does mean you don't get the clanking when the bottles go down the corridor.
That is true. Paper bottles would be fantastic for next time we're in Manchester.
Recycling on Monday. That's embarrassing for them.
Anymore. Electra, lady at the far end. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Miranda Barker from East Lancs Chamber of Commerce. Two things. Firstly, I agree that end targets haven't changed, but the messaging matters. And I think we have to remember how catastrophic it was when the feed-in tariffs were ripped away from the solar industry. And that wasn't about this sector's unsuccessful, it was just about messaging. So we need to be more careful. But in terms of the ways in which government could help, obviously there are things that cost money, like grid infrastructure, but there are also things that don't cost money, like changing the apprenticeship levy to a skills and apprenticeship levy, because the logistics sector have 6-week courses they need to give people to get them directly into jobs. But also things like planning and procurement. The local authorities are waiting for government to set baseline planning for net zero tech to be in buildings, because they won't do it themselves because they're worried about displacement. And procurement mechanisms, the NHS is really taking a lead, where they're saying that from the 1st of April next year, every supplier, whether it's for bagels or bandages, has to have a carbon reduction plan. Can we see the rest of the public sector go down that same route? And those policy changes wouldn't cost government anything.
I suspect having to prepare a carbon reduction plan might cost businesses something, though. Would that be an additional cost for you?
If you take public sector catering, we're already moving in that direction. We have all of our own, carbon net zero plans. Businesses are doing it. Yes, it isn't cost-free, and I think it is about open source and sharing, so that we can take the learnings from the biggest companies who are having to do it from an investor, from a consumer, from an employee perspective, and share that. So we are doing that. We're working with Compass and Sodexo, who feed us the hospitals, the prisons, the schools, who are working with government procurement targets. I do think government procurement targets could take account of that, and that's an area where government could work with business to make sure it doesn't cause problems and does help. But I think business is already moving in that direction. The one point I would pick up on as well, which doesn't get looked at very much when we talk about carbon reduction, the big challenge is going to be decarbonising our buildings. And I do think you're right that that's where government does have a role in helping to determine where the responsibility for that lies. Who shares it, how's it managed, and how does it come about? Because we've got a mixture of ownership uses and in the economy, and particularly in hospitality.
Kevin, I imagine the government's very keen on things it could do that don't cost any money.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. I mean, we've got £2.5 trillion in debt. We've got a 3-figure deficit that's 100 billion plus. I mean, anybody tells you you've got loads of money to spend, Liz trusted last year, it's going to end in tears. So we've got to be realistic about this stuff. Feed-in tariffs is a really good example, and it's ancient history now, but that was kind of ill thought out policy in the first place, in that we didn't realise the race that people would jump on the bandwagon so quickly, massively overspent. I think we set aside 7 billion, we spent 9.6 billion before the scheme had even ended. So we've got to make sure our policy making is well considered. And this is a bit of a pitch for Rishi, I guess, his longer term decisions. He's very good at that, looking at this stuff and making sure we make good decisions and we don't have to change things down the road. And one of the things we had to change quite recently in the race to net zero, that Rishi changed, was about the energy efficiency requirements of a property you let out, a residential property, which would have been catastrophic for the letting sector, because it would have pulled probably 30% of the property that's currently being let out of the supply, out of the market, and that would be terrible for tenants. So you've got to think this stuff through properly and make sure we make good decisions that do stand the test of time, and that's what we're here to do as a government. And I think you'll see better decision making coming down the line.
We can only hope. Can I take this question, please?
Thanks very much. It's Guy from Heineken. And to answer the question, I mean, we're being helped in our brewery in Manchester about just over 10% of a big capital project that we're doing to introduce heat pumps into there. Obviously, they make a lot of heat through the brewing process, just like distilling. And the heat pump process will mean that we can turn that brewery net zero shortly, partly helped by funding from the government.
Okay.
Just to go to your point about EPCs for domestic properties, we've also got this problem with pubs because we've got to supply pubs, and they have a challenge to go to level C by 2027 and B by 2030. We just don't quite know how they're going to do that at the moment, and I'm sure Kate's got a lot to say on this as well. And we're worried about those SMEs up and down the country that could have to close their doors at the moment if they can't meet that. We've looked at it for domestic. Would we consider looking at it for those businesses as well?
Kate, do you just want to touch on the challenges before?
Yes, I mean, it is a very real challenge. There is this lack of clarity and certainty, which I just touched on when I was talking about buildings. Whose responsibility is that? How is it shared? Who meets it? How do we work together? I do think, again, it is one of those places and areas where we need to look sensibly at those targets. When you've got a sector, particularly on the SME side, that is leasehold property coming down the track, how do you incentivise them? How do you make it work? How do you make it practical? Because I think Guy's absolutely right. You're going to have lots of small businesses that are going to be forced to close their doors because they won't be able to meet it. So is 2027 realistic? If we can have a bit of pragmatism and listening from government to help us with that, I think, you know, the Minister's right. You look at the end objective. How are we going to achieve that? How are we going to do it in the right way? If that necessitates a pause to get it right, I'd be happy to work with government to try and do that.
Do you think you'd consider a pause?
Yes, absolutely. And I think we should look at it. I'm not saying we pause it or whatever, but I think arbitrary targets are the wrong way to do this. You've got to make sure there is a glide path and everyone understands how we'll meet that glide path. And so if it's going to have the unintended consequence of pushing up rents or putting people out of business, which is also always bad for consumers, of course, then that's the kind of consequence we don't want and we couldn't tolerate. So yes, I think I'm right in saying Heineken are part of that refillable bottle scheme. So thank you for what you're doing there. It's a brilliant initiative, and I'm glad we've been able to help in terms of your decarbonisation of your heating.
Yeah, I think it's exactly the same situation as you've got with the domestic situation.
Yeah, it is.
You're going to have
it,
premises that are just pulled from the market because they won't be able to be let.
Sure, absolutely. Well, we're very happy to look at that.
Thank you.
I suppose just as my final question before I wrap up, if I could go around the panel and just say, if there was one thing that you could ask government to start doing that would help and stop doing that's currently hindering, if I let my three non-governmental panellists come and then Kevin can wrap up for us. Jim, we'll start with you.
I was walking past the protesters outside on my way to get some lunch before, and I took a photo of a sign that said we can walk, ride, recycle, shop and grow our way to zero carbon, and we absolutely can. But I think the really important thing is that we as industry and the governments in all their shapes and forms around the UK think about those small incremental steps as well as that big picture. Be a realistic, reliable investment partners, set clear visions, set clear policies and stick to them, because that's what we're doing in manufacturing and that's what we expect of government as our partner as well.
You stole my line about incremental changes. I'll just build on that. I think it's about what more could government do? Work as a committed, pragmatic, sensible partner with us, a genuine partnership to be able to deliver this, because this is too big for any of us to be able to tackle on our own. And then the final bit would be, you know, what could they do? What could they do more, or could they stop doing? I suppose it's two sides of the same coin. It's about incentivising business to help deliver against that. That doesn't need to be fiscal, but it needs to be pragmatic. So it might be that it's looking at offsetting some regulatory challenges by helping us to prioritise, but being honest with us about what is the priority and how do we get there.
It's definitely an advantage in these occasions go last in a round of answers.
It's horrible to go middle all the time.
I'm so sorry.
Because I certainly agree with the incremental point and the small changes, and the grid is a perfect example of that. Agree on partnership. I mean, stepping a bit back from this discussion, listening to what you were just saying about pubs and Heineken, the need for a plan for hospitality. You know, this is a sector which is so important for the life of our high streets, for attracting investors into the UK. So that goes wider than or more specific than net zero, but it comes through very clearly in this discussion. To stop, and I think it's a difficult process to stop, but regulatory divergence across the UK. That's something which we definitely want to see avoided.
Final word.
Yes. Well, the overarching thing I would say about certainly my politics is politics should not be about politicians. It shouldn't be what's in my interest or anybody else in who's in an elected position around the country. There's a temptation to remake a policy so you can put it in your name as a minister or as Secretary of State or a Prime Minister. We shouldn't get involved in that either, which feeds back to the incremental improvements. Big fan of Dave Brailsford. And it should be evolution, not revolution, and give you that certainty of the future. The other thing this cannot be achieved by is the benevolence of chief execs sat in boardrooms saying, okay, we're going to have these wonderful ESG goals. This has got to be about a glide path of regulation coming from government that's consistent. Of course, there'll be course corrections. I can't promise there will not be, because there's some things we do not know. We just don't know what we don't know. So there's bound to be times we get it wrong, and that's a reality. We've got to accept that's the case. But the number one thing we're trying to achieve is to make those good long-term decisions, but to have this glide path, this smooth glide path to 2050 with some of those marker posts along, those milestones along the path. So totally get what business wants, and it's what I would have wanted had I still been in my business back in over the last 30 years. So very instructive for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of our audience and our great questions. I hope you'll keep in touch with CapEx and the CPS by signing up to our newsletters. Just to say, we've got 3 more panels today. So next up is how can Britain adapt to a more unpredictable world? That's Oliver Dowden is joining that panel. At 5 o'clock, we're asking, can we ever cut taxes again? With Andrew Griffith and Andrea Leadsom. And then our final panel at 6:30 is Justice for the Young, where we're addressing the intergenerational divide. That one will have wine, just as a heads up if anyone needs a drink pre-reception. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to my panel, and especially to Pernod Ricard for their sponsorship.
Thank you. Thank you.